and questions in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you see there, it'll be there. CPD certificates will be loaded to the SADA platform, and you'll be able to access all your certificates under your member profile. If you are not a SADA member, you will be able to create a profile for yourself and access your CPD certificates. The event for tonight qualifies for 1 ethical CEU. We are streaming live on YouTube also, just in case you have difficulty accessing the Zoom platform. Please complete the evaluation after the webinar, and 2 polls will be done during the webinar, and please answer those polls. And we'd just like to thank Nedbank for sponsoring this. Secondly, the upcoming events. On the 2nd of March, the SADA Free State branch is presenting apical control to endodontics, working more precisely, guided by technology, and that's going to be presented by Dr. Heinrich Duppenaar. And on the 4th of March, the Dental Assistant Recognition Week, the psychological impact of COVID-19 on dental assistance and laughter. This free of charge stress buster brought to you by Ms. Mutibi Tabatso and Miss Elise Jacobs. Right, so Nikki, if you'd like to take over and start your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. So once again, from our side, we just want to apologize. I know you were all expecting Matimba to give you a talk today, and he was more than ready, and he's been literally very upset that his Zoom just failed to connect, didn't want to work, didn't want to open. But it does work on my system. So today you have, unfortunately, a much older, but hopefully a much wiser person speaking to you today than the youngsters. But in any case, so the aim here for me literally is to give you a bird's eye view of the budget so you can get a sense of what were the sort of key issues that we saw in the budget. And also, you know, it really tells the story of South Africa's challenge to a large extent. And hopefully by the time we're done, you will all have a very clear impression and a very clear image in your head of the challenges we face going forward. So let's start with the first slide. Yep, it's all working. That's great. And just look and remind ourselves, October last year, what was the sort of key challenges we faced? Let's set the scene here before we go any further. So the first thing I think to bear in mind is that South Africa has been on an unsustainable fiscal track for quite some time. Really, from 2009 is when it started, and we've really never been able to get ourselves on a sustainable footing ever since then. Now, this graph shows you, as our finance minister put it, the hippo's jaws, right? And that they were widening and they were opening really, really wide. And what we had for an extended period of time is that expenditure, which is the red line there, continued to outpace revenue. Now, if you're a government, your revenue is largely determined by taxes, and expenditure is to a large extent driven by your own policies. And also, of course, by the social needs that are out there. Now, in our case, of course, we got to a situation where we've been on an unsustainable fiscal path for quite some time. And a lot of it started long before COVID-19 struck. Now, COVID-19 made everything a lot worse. That stretched the hippo's jaws. So you see this widening gap between government expenditure on the one side and government revenue on the other side. And of course, that gap means that government does not have sufficient funds to fund its expenditure, and it therefore has to borrow that money. So this really is a reflection of the extent to which we are constantly borrowing money, adding to our debt burden, and how that over time further inflates, of course, your expenditure. But the point I wanted to make is COVID made things worse, a lot worse. There's no denying that. But we've been on the wrong track for a long time. And let's just look at what drives expenditure and what has contributed, what drives revenue and what has contributed to the situation we find ourselves in now, where revenue is actually under pressure. Well, since 2009, We have seen under President Zuma, of course, that corruption became deeply entrenched in the public sector. We've heard the horror stories of state capture and to what extent it has infiltrated virtually every part of our lives, specifically how it's hollowed out state-owned enterprises. And of course, state-owned enterprises matter because they provide all South Africa's economic infrastructure. We are talking about electricity, a road, rail, port infrastructure. All of that is provided by state-owned enterprises. Then we've also seen very poor decisions that, of course, to a large extent has been driven by nefarious motives and often also by corruption itself. And all of that combined has led to a situation where, like the Medupi and Kusile, the 2 new power plants that we built, we spent triple the original budget on it. It took double the time it was meant to take. And at the end of the day, we discover we have a deeply flawed and structurally default 2 new power stations. And so as a result of that combination of corruption and poor decisions, no accountability, very poor governance, terrible project implementation, we've got to a situation where all our infrastructure have really decayed. We've had constant power outages since 2008. That is now more than a decade already. And that's just power. Our road, rail, our ports are equally unreliable, are equally expensive. We have one among the most expensive port tariffs in the world. Why is that the case? It's not something you can really explain. And of course, all of this does push up the cost of doing business in South Africa. It makes it more expensive for companies to operate here, and slowly and surely it erodes profits. And as it erodes company profits, government gets less taxes in the form of revenue. And of course, if companies are not making sufficient profits, they don't expand their operations, they don't undertake fixed investment. And in that, as a result of that, of course, if you're not expanding your operations, you won't employ more people. And therefore, you have high unemployment. If there are less people earning an income, there are less people paying income tax. And there are also less people spending. And all of this has contributed to a situation where taxes have been under pressure and the green line have been tilting downwards. And of course, what happens on the one side of the economy feeds over into the other side of the economy. And what are the factors that have occurred here? Well, first and foremost, if you have high unemployment, you have a much higher social burden. If you have high unemployment, you have much higher crime levels. At the same time, of course, if you have defunct state-owned enterprises and they're all incredibly reliant on the fiscus to really pay the interest on their debt, and also at the same time, in many cases like Denel and so forth, pay the wages of their staff, then of course that adds to government expenditure. And then the ultimate outcome of this, and on some of the very poor decisions that have been made, is of course that during the Zuma years, government made the deliberate decision that they will become the employer of last resort. And that was part of ex-President Zuma's whole patronage system. And so the public sector just exploded. The civil service became so enormous compared to the size of the economy. And now you have an enormous public sector wage bill. That adds to your expenditure. And at the end of the day, the bottom line is that expenditure explodes. So all of these things are related. We didn't get here by accident. It has been the result of poor choices, of corruption, of allowing things to spiral out of control. And then on top of that came COVID-19, and that made everything a lot worse. So at the end of last year, in October, the government represented the mini budget, and it gave a very gloomy picture. And they said as much. They said we've reached the end of the road, revenue have imploded, that being tax revenue, expenditure as a result of all the COVID-related spending has exploded. And we're now probably going to have to, we're probably going to run a budget deficit of 15.7% of GDP, which is enormous, right? Absolutely enormous. Now, for all of you to know, the golden rule when it comes to deficits is that a country should not allow its budget deficit, that being the extent to which its expenditure exceeds its revenue, that a country should not allow that to get to over 3% of the size of its economy. If it does that, then it's adding to its its debt burden far too rapidly. And then, of course, your debt runs away, your debt carries interest, and very quickly your interest bill just starts to explode and explode and explode. And before you know where you are, you could find yourself in a debt trap, which is a situation where you start to borrow money simply to pay the interest on your debt, which is, of course, the last place in the world we want to be. Then you become like a Venezuela, you become like an Argentina. So we don't want to be in that situation. But to put it in perspective, we've been running budget deficits of over 3% of GDP for over a decade now. So we've been on a really unsustainable path for an extended period of time. And added to that, last year the deficit was anticipated to explode to 15.7% of GDP. So clearly it was crisis time. Now the question is, that was October last year when they presented this very grim picture. Now the question, of course, is, has anything changed? Did things get any better? What does this budget present? So let's have a quick look at that. Let's run through it. Was last year as gloomy as they thought in October last year? So let's fast forward to what was announced yesterday, and let's look first and foremost at the outcome of last year, or the last fiscal year that we're just coming out of now, which is 2020-2021. Now, the reality is it was bad. There's no angle from which you can look at 2020 and come to the conclusion that it was all right. It was terrible. And its impact on government's finances was equally dramatic. But the good news is it wasn't quite as bad as they thought it would be in October last year. And this is the first little bit we show you. You see this, literally this sort of beige area here. There we have the estimates that they put out in February last year, with February's last year's national budget for the fiscal year 2020-21. And this was a very innocent time. We didn't know there was something horrible, some sneaky little cunning virus called COVID-19 that was eventually going to force the whole world economy into lockdown. We were very innocent back then. But you can already see our deficits were enormous. They were already, before COVID struck, budgeted to hit 6.8% of GDP. Then came October, and of course, that's the grim picture I've just talked you through. And now we get, of course, to the final outcome for the fiscal year that we are just leaving behind. And you can see, instead of running a budget deficit of 15.7%, it's actually going to be, a little bit better at 14%. So that's not too bad. Now, how did this happen? It's mainly because the moment they lifted level 5 lockdown, the economy started to recover. The biggest amount of damage to this economy was done by level 5 lockdown. So the moment they started easing those restrictions, the economy started to recover, and tax revenue bounced back a lot quicker than they thought. There's another little bit of good news, or maybe not good news. Nobody likes paying taxes, but it does look that under our new commissioner, that SOES is starting to turn the corner, so they're becoming far more efficient in their tax collections. So that's a little bit of good news. And as a result, we're running a slightly smaller deficit for the year that has just passed, that is good news. It's still an enormous deficit, but it's not as bad as they thought it would be. Now we're going to focus on the next 3 years. The fiscal year we're just about to enter, which is 2021-22, then also 22-23 and 23-24. And we are going to look at what are they planning for South Africa in terms of government revenue. What do they think they're going to get in terms of taxes? How are they going to get it in? What did they propose in the budget yesterday? And then we're also going to look at how they're going to spend our tax revenue. And at the end of the day, we're going to look at the deficit and ask ourselves, are they likely to live within their means? All right. And will they be able to chip away at that budget deficit? So we're now going to focus on the next 3 years. And let's just first ask ourselves, was there anything good about yesterday's budget speech? Well, the best news about yesterday's budget speech is that they got a little bit more ambitious in trying to reduce that budget deficit. It's absolutely essential that they try and bring expenditure more in line with government revenue, all right? And that they try and reduce the deficit on an annual basis, because that actually means you borrow less. So your debt doesn't rise as quickly as it would under other circumstances. So it's absolutely essential. Now, one of the good sort of messages, the good takeouts of yesterday was really that they are aiming to reduce the budget deficit a little bit faster than they indicated they would in October last year. Now, there you can see the mini budget of October last year. They thought that then they would need 3 years to bring the budget deficit back to about 7.3% of GDP, which is still hugely unsustainable. And now they're a little bit more upbeat. They think they can do it a little bit faster. They can bring it down to about 6.3%. In 3 years' time, which is still miles away from that golden 3% sustainable level. It's not even within reach, but at least it is faster than they thought they would be able to do it in October last year. So how are they going to achieve this? Well, this little graph takes us back to the hippo's jaws. We are again looking at government expenditure in red there. We're looking at government revenue in green. Sorry, folks, let me just get a sip of water here. And what you can see is they are really relying on government revenue bouncing back. So what do they expect? They are relying on tax revenue bouncing back. You can see that thin little dotted line. That was the estimates they put out at the mini budget in October last year. And the thicker little green line there, that is the estimates they came out with in yesterday's budget. Now, as far as expenditure is concerned, they're still going to try and cut expenditure quite sharply in this fiscal year that's coming up. But over the next 2 years, the following 2 years, they're going to allow for a little bit more expenditure than they anticipated during the mini budget. But the bottom line is, it's really tax revenue that they hope will do the heavy lifting for them. Now, remember, what drives tax revenue? It's really economic growth. I've already explained that cycle to you. If your economy is growing, companies are making profit, they pay more taxes. If they employ more people, they pay more taxes. If those people spend more because their income is rising, they pay more taxes. So it's economic growth. It is absolutely essential in driving government's tax take at the end of the day. So that means if you're going to budget out for 3 years, which has a major impact on this economy, you have to have a reliable GDP forecast to base that revenue estimates on, those tax revenue estimates on. So that's the first test, is do they have a reliable economic forecast? And the answer is yes, they do. Their forecasts are not unrealistic at all. This is what they think the economy will do over the next 3 years. That was obviously last year was an absolute disaster where the economy shrunk by it's going to probably shrink by close to 7.2%. And then they're expecting this year that the economy will grow by 3.3%. And they're a little bit more upbeat over 2022 and 2023, but that's fractional stuff. Overall, how does their forecast compare to the rest of the world? Well, it's pretty much in line with the market forecast. As an example of a private sector forecast, I show you Nedbank's forecast there in green. I also show you in the second little graph the Reserve Bank's forecast. And you can see Treasury is very close to us. We're a little bit more upbeat about this year. We think the economy will probably be able to clock about 3.5% growth. And then we're a little bit less optimistic about the longer term than they are, or the medium term rather, than they are. But you can see they are still very conservative, because the Reserve Bank is even more optimistic than they are. So they're being as realistic as they possibly can. And the very important thing to bear in mind also is that in their GDP forecast, National Treasury is not banking on any benefits from the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan that was announced by the president last year. They're hoping that over the longer term that will help to lift South Africa's growth rate, but they're not banking on it. They've not built that into their GDP forecasts in any way. Now, obviously, the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, that is a talk for a whole nother day. It's got 4 pillars. Listen, there's nothing wrong with the plan. South Africa's biggest problem has always been implementation. People are always saying government needs a new rule book. They need to be more innovative. No, governments don't need to be innovative. They need to do the basics right. And our problem is that our government doesn't do the basics right, and also that they don't implement the basics, even when they know what they are supposed to be doing. So implementation is the problem in South Africa. Leave the innovation, leave the growth for the private sector. They're better at it anyway. So there are 4 pillars to this Reconstruction and Recovery Plan that was put out last year. Obviously, defeating COVID, that's absolutely essential. At least the vaccination drive is in process. It's going very slowly. Based on what we've heard, and you'll probably know more than I do on this front, it looks like South Africa, if everything goes according to plan, could reach herd immunity by around February 2023. Now, this is South Africa. Nothing ever goes according to plan. So I think we have to count on the fact that we'll probably only reach herd immunity a bit later than that, but at least it started. Another pillar of the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan is, of course, to accelerate economic growth through infrastructure spending. Also a good idea. We need infrastructure. We don't have sufficient power capacity or power infrastructure. We need better road, rail, and port infrastructure. We need better data and telecommunication infrastructure. So in principle, it's a good idea. We'll come back to whether this budget is actually going to implement any of that. We'll come back to that. But in any case, that is one of government's plans. As you heard in the State of the Nation address, President Ramaphosa said they are embarking on a massive, those are his words, not mine, a massive infrastructure drive. Okay, so we'll revisit that. Then economic reforms that are absolutely essential. What are those? Well, you've got to deregulate the energy markets. You've got to develop energy capacity outside of Eskom. That means you've got to change the legislation. You've got to deal with the labor market. You've got to make it more flexible. You've got to basically get rid of corruption. You've got to restructure the budget so that you spend less on consumption expenditure and more on capital expenditure. But unfortunately, structural reforms are difficult and they are painful and they carry short-term costs, but they are absolutely essential to making your economy more efficient. But government has promised to undertake this to try and lower the cost of production. And then the last bit is fighting corruption and strengthening the state, which obviously also have to happen. But the key point is we have got this plan, and there's nothing wrong with the plan itself. But government will have to implement it. And National Treasury in this year's budget are not banking on any gains to economic growth from this plan. So they kept their estimates for GDP growth very conservative and very realistic. So now what we're going to do, we've determined that they're going to be trying to reduce this budget deficit a little bit quicker than they saw than they planned in October last year. We've determined that they've based their tax estimates on a realistic GDP forecast. Now we're going to look at some of the details. We're going to start by looking at what they are planning and what their estimates is for revenue over the medium term. That is the next 3 years. And then we're going to delve into expenditure. And then lastly, we're going to look at the actual size of the deficit, what it means for our debt going forward. So let's start on the revenue side. Listen, folks, they're planning to grow, government revenue by 11.6% this year. And that seems a lot. So tax revenue goes up 11.6%, but bear in mind that it's coming off an incredibly low base. It imploded last year by 11. And then they're going to grow it by 7.6 and 5.6%. Is this doable? Actually, it's very doable because firstly, remember last year was an extraordinary year. A lot more businesses are allowed to operate at this point in time. All of the tax deferrals you had last year will now come into effect. So you'll have back payments of taxes coming in. You have a higher level of general economic activity. So there's a big base effect. That base effect on its own is at least a 5 or 6% increase. Then they're expecting real GDP growth of around 3.3%, and inflation is probably going to clock around 4%. So yeah, they're probably going to overshoot that 11.6% quite easily. So all of these targets are actually very conservative. So they've been very conservative on revenue, and they're probably going to do a lot better than that. And added to that, as I've said before, we believe that SOES is starting to get its act together. It is starting to sort itself out. So they probably have some efficiency in spending. So within the context of this budget, they've set very realistic revenue targets. What did they do on the tax front? Well, despite us coming from an incredibly difficult fiscal position, where last year we ran essentially a budget deficit of 14% of GDP, which is enormous. Government has not increased taxes. That's the best news about this budget. And it's the right thing to do because everybody took a massive hit last year. So it would have been absolutely ridiculous to now go and hike taxes on top of that. So this budget is tax neutral. It gives you a little bit of tax relief, mainly by adjusting mainly to personal income taxes. That's where the main relief is centered. And they're adjusting the brackets for more than the impact of inflation. Inflation last year was about 3.3%, and they're adjusting the various tax brackets where the various tax rates kick in by effectively 5%. So they're giving you more than the rate of inflation compensation, and as a result, that should certainly help. Okay, and then the other thing to consider is, of course, that whatever government gives, it has to take back, and it does that for indirect taxes. So yes, they give a little bit of relief in personal income taxes, but they also, of course, are pushing up indirect taxes, especially on alcohol and tobacco, but there's nothing too dramatic there, and that means this is a tax neutral budget. They give you a little bit on the personal incomes front, but they take back a little bit in terms of indirect taxes. So it's a tax neutral budget without a doubt. Right. For some reason, it looks like my presentation is freezing. Okay, there we go. It's back online. All right. So that's really the revenue side of things. There's nothing exciting there, but at least all of these fears of a special tax to fund the vaccine, higher wealth taxes, none of that came to fruition. So government gave us all a bit of a break as far as that's concerned, and they've put in very achievable revenue targets the way it looks to us. Now we need to look at expenditure. So what is the expenditure story about? Well, on the expenditure front, literally, you are looking at a situation of there's no scope. I mean, if you're running budget deficits of over 3% of GDP, your scope to actually grow spending is very limited. And this budget really illustrates this. Government is going to try and cut expenditure by 1.6% this year in nominal terms, right? So that means in inflation adjusted terms, you're looking at about a real cut of 5% in expenditure. Then they're going to grow it very, very slowly over 2022-23 and the fiscal year 23-24 by far less than the rate of inflation. So that's going to be nominal growth in spending, but still a real cut in spending. So over the 3 years, in inflation adjusted terms, they want to cut spending quite significantly. Now, it is absolutely essential that they do this, but this has never been done by this government ever before, not since 1994. During the manual years, what they did is they made sure that growth in government spending did not exceed inflation, but they have never managed to put through a nominal cut in expenditure. All right. So this is very challenging, but it shows you how serious the situation is and how serious government is, that we have to cut spending. And this is really showing the world, showing investors out there, showing rating agencies out there that National Treasury and government is serious about getting expenditure under control and trying to close those hippo jaws. All right. Can this be done? All right. So it's a very ambitious target. Can it be done? So let's first remind ourselves what are the largest expenditure categories. So what makes up the biggest portion or the biggest slice of government expenditure? Well, there you go. It's that red bar. It is the compensation of employees. It eats up the bulk of government's expenditure, over 32% going simply to the public sector wage bill. Then you can look at this yellow bar. It is standing at 13.4%. That is debt service costs. Now we'll talk about that in a second. And then the rest, really, the other big expenditure categories really make sense. You know, we're a developing country. We have very high levels of inequality. We have a very difficult past. We have very high levels of unemployment. So yes, you would expect education, social protection, healthcare, economic affairs, and public order and safety to make up a fair slice of government expenditure. So those all seem fine. But of course, what this tells us is that really where government should be focusing its attention, if it wants to get the most bang for its buck, if it wants to get the biggest yield for the pain it's about to undertake of cutting spending, where it should focus its energy is on the compensation of employees, because that is the biggest portion of government spending. And of course, then you have debt service costs. So before we go anywhere, I'm going to talk about compensation of employees soon. Let's just quickly have a look at debt service cost. What can government do about debt service cost? Nothing in the short term. It just continues to grow. It will be the fastest growing item in the budget over the next 3 years. And what is it a result of? It is a result of 10 years of running budget deficits of over 3% of GDP and having to fund those shortfalls on an annual basis. And therefore your debt starts to run away. It is the result of 10 years of poor economic management, poor fiscal management, state-owned enterprise bailout after bailout that eventually got us to a situation where we were downgraded. Our sovereign risk ratings have been downgraded to sub-investment grade. And that means that there's a higher risk premium attached to South Africa's debt. So the interest you pay on the debt you're funding or having to raise is also higher. So that's what your debt service cost essentially is. It's a function of the size of your borrowing and the interest you have to pay on that. And yes, how significant is it going to be? It's going to be enormous. Debt service cost will climb from its share of spending will go from this fiscal year, where it's 13.4% of government expenditure, it will rise to over 16% over the next 3 years. More frighteningly, it's going to eat up about 21% of tax revenue in 3 years' time. So just servicing the interest on our debt will gobble up 21% of our tax revenue by the time we get to 2023-24. So not a good place to be. How does our debt service cost compare to those of other emerging markets? Well, I'm afraid we look bad on that front. The only one 1,000 times worse than us is Sri Lanka, but then they have been caught in a war and violent conflict for a very long time. So not really surprising as far as that's concerned, that they build up a massive debt burden. And so frankly, we have among the highest average debt service cost burdens as a percentage of our tax revenue in the emerging market universe. So really not a good place to be. But like I said, there's not much they can do about that other than try and stick to the plan they've set out, which is to try and reduce this budget deficit faster than they thought they would be able to do it. And very importantly, that means they've got to stick to these expenditure estimates they've put out, which, as I said, is very tight. It really is very tight, and it's something governments never achieved. So what do they need to focus on? We've already identified it. They need to focus on that red bar, the biggest slice of government spending, which is compensation of employees. Right. So what are they planning for that? Well, the good news is they are focusing on that. So their attention is in the right place. The other bit of good news, sorry, folks, is that they're going to try and contain it. Last year, we saw that public sector wages rose by only 2.1%, but there was a wage freeze in place. They're hoping to keep it at that level this year, which is less than the rate of inflation. So again, we are talking about a real or inflation adjusted cut in public sector wages. And then they really want to tighten it. Let it grow only 0.9% 22-23 and only 0.5% in fiscal 23-24. And those are quite big cuts in real or inflation adjusted terms. So they're looking to grow wages by far less than the rate of inflation over the next 3 years. And they're hoping that that will help them achieve their very tight expenditure target. Now, again, you can see it's not going to be easy. The worst bit about this is we don't know whether they will succeed. We don't know whether they will succeed. There's a constitutional court hearing coming out on whether the wage freeze last year was legal or not. If the constitutional court hearing goes against them, they will have to pay civil service back wages. They're not going to make those those expenditure estimates. They're not going to make those cuts if they have to do that. Then the wage negotiations for the next 3 years, that's still coming up, all right? And unions and government, they say they're talking to each other, but in all honesty, we know that the unions are vehemently opposed to this wage proposal by government. So we don't know what the outcome is going to be. That's the bottom line. Is government being unrealistic? Are they being unfair to civil servants? No, they're not. Look at the sort of wage increases we've seen in the civil service over the last couple of years, way above the rate of inflation. In the private sector, your average wage increase have been between 4 and 5%. At most, it's been 1% above the rate of inflation. So no, they're not being unreasonable. Civil servants in South Africa are well paid, period, compared to the private sector. And they are, frankly, well paid compared to many civil services in the world. How do we compare to the rest of the world? Well, our compensation of civil servants as a percentage of the size of our economy is among the highest in the world, 14.8% of GDP. The only countries that are higher than us are exceptionally rich countries like Norway, you know, and you would all agree with us that we are not nearly as wealthy as Norway and Iceland and many of your sort of Scandinavian countries. So it's absolutely ridiculous. It has to be done. But again, given South African politics, given South Africa's dynamic, we can't assure that it will. So their focus is in the right place. This year's budget and their ability to slowly bring South Africa to a situation where we start to live within our means. We don't have this massive budget deficits that have to be funded through increased borrowing, and we don't have this escalation in our debt burden. All of it really hinges on their ability to control the public sector wage bill. They can't do much about debt service cost. That's a legacy of the deficits we ran in the past. That's the legacy of the buildup in debt we've already seen. That's going to be the fastest growing item in the budget over the next 3 years. But you can see they're cutting all other spending with the exception of education, housing, and recreation and culture. But recreation and culture is such a small part of the budget, it's minuscule. The big thing is they need to keep it within that 1.2% for the public sector wage bill. Social security, they're putting through very big cuts, but remember, they're hoping to bring an end to the COVID-19 emergency support, and that obviously is therefore just a function of the base. Sorry, folks. Let me just get another little sip of water there. All right, so On social security, though, I mean, we often hear people saying things like, we've got too many people on government handouts and things like that. And we do. 18.5 million people receive some form of government handout in South Africa. But the reality is, as a percentage of GDP, it's only 3.7%. You compare that to the compensation of employees, and it's minuscule. And what this does is prevent absolute suffering. So I'm not really in that score. I think it is necessary spending, and it's the humane thing to do, and it isn't really that expensive to the economy. So what do we need to do? We need to grow this economy. And in order to do that, we do need to undertake infrastructure spending. Now, I told you, the president said in the State of the Nation address that they are going to embark on an aggressive infrastructure program, a massive infrastructure program. And they have indeed made provision for that in the budget. They're going to grow government infrastructure spending from 187 billion in 2020 to 275 billion. Now, you might say to yourself, that sounds like a lot. That sounds very impressive. The truth of the matter is these are all nominal values. And no, it's not. As a percentage of GDP, it remains minuscule at 4.7% of GDP. Do we need infrastructure spending? We absolutely do. Look, this shows you the breakdown of fixed investment activity in South Africa. What has been one of the biggest factors driving the deterioration in South Africa's economic growth rate has been the implosion in state-owned enterprises. Why did they matter so much? Because, as I said before, they provide all South Africa's economic infrastructure. So if they are falling apart, the burden it puts on a private company in order to just run its business is enormous. Like, for example, without electricity, without road, rail, port infrastructure, it's very difficult for private companies to expand their operations. In fact, very expensive indeed, unless you afford. And you can, for example, go and put in your own power capacity. State-owned enterprises have to deliver, or they have to be deregulated so that somebody else can deliver that infrastructure. Just to show you where we are on electricity, we have got a situation where today, look at that red line, that is Eskom's electricity provision. And you can see that today, after we built 2 new power plants, right, which is remarkable, we produce less electricity than we did in 2004. So this is our problem. If we want to grow this economy, if we want to undertake infrastructure spending, we have to first resolve this energy crisis. And until we've done that, it's actually pointless talking about this. So yes, they've budgeted for some infrastructure spending, but ultimately, as a percentage of GDP, it remains very tiny. The big emphasis here is on those structural reforms. The big emphasis here is really on fixing Eskom, and more importantly, developing generating capacity outside of Eskom. Then there's a chance that we could actually grow. Right, so that's the budget, folks. There really isn't a lot more to it. Now, the last question is, are these deficit targets achievable? Will they be able to reduce the deficit to 6.3% of GDP? To be honest with you, yes, I think they will. I'm gonna end this by just showing you this slide. It is absolutely essential that they have to do this. They are probably going to spend more than they've set out in this budget, but their revenue is also going to overshoot, right? And so the last and final thing to bear in mind is they cannot fail. It's absolutely essential that they succeed, because this is what will happen to our debt if we fail. It will go to that red line. Now, at the moment, they're hoping to contain it where our debt burden peaks at 89% of the size of our economy by 25, 26, and then it starts to come down. If they don't succeed in doing this, we are most definitely going to run into a debt trap, and we simply can't afford it. So what do I think of this budget? I think it's a fairly decent budget. I think they they were in a terrible situation. They did the best they could. The most positive news here is that they're trying to reduce the budget deficit a little bit faster. The other bit of really good news is that they gave you all a little bit of relief in terms of personal income taxes. They didn't push up taxes. Our worst fears as far as that is concerned didn't materialize. So that's good news, but it's going to be a battle. It is really going to be a battle to rein in this deficit and to control this debt burden. Okay. Why? Because the battle is to reduce the public sector wage bill. That's what it's coming down to now. And like I say, we don't know what that outcome will be. So folks, it's a little bit of a balancing act. That's what they presented yesterday. And yeah, I hope that it's giving you a bit of insight, especially to the challenge they face, but also maybe a little bit hope that we are taking baby steps in the right direction. All right. So that's it from me. I don't know if there are any questions.
Thank you very much.
Or how you wanted to do this, since I stepped in the last minute.
Thank you very much for that very insightful and frank presentation. Before we take questions, I'd like to just ask you a question regarding our Honourable Finance Minister. Now, a lot of the expenditure, I believe, is going to be based on what he can do. Now, there's three things I'd like to ask. One, will he have the support of government to push through these his wishes? Two, will he be there for the foreseeable future? And the third one, and this is a lot with the unions, will he be able to do it?
Okay, so again, those are all very good questions, are very pertinent questions, and they're questions, sadly, where I have to disappoint you. I don't have the answers. I know that the rumor was that Tito Mboweni didn't want to stick around forever. He came in to do a fix-it job, and it's taking longer than he thought. He isn't incredibly fond of politics. And, you know, he was never interested in staying on for the long haul. That's the rumor. That's what we all heard. We don't know. I mean, I don't know him well enough that he would tell me or provide me with any insight on that. But what is clear is that he's going to stick around for now. He is going to try his best to push it through. Will he get the cooperation of the rest of government? We were told by National Treasury that they have cabinet on board, but we've been told this before, and that it didn't materialize. I think the big thing here really is that whether they like it or not, ultimately they're going to have no choice. You know, the way they've now work themselves into a corner as far as finances is concerned, at the end of the day, they're going to have no choice. So whether they like it or not, they're going to have to comply. And because when you run out of money, there is no more mercy. There is no more gentle way. There's only the hard and the brutal and the painful way. But I think the biggest challenge is the public sector wage agreements, the negotiations coming up, and whether in fact they will be able to succeed. It absolutely has to be done. I know in South Africa, we always get these heavily emotionally loaded conversations from the unions, but the reality is that they are not underpaid. And the reality is that they've had above inflation wage increases for an extended period of time. So I think it's time that they join the rest of South Africa and make a bit of a sacrifice as well. So will they succeed in that? I honestly do not know. I really, really do not know. I hope they do, but I think it's going to be a battle. I think at the end of the day, both parties will compromise, but I think you're going to hear a lot of noise. You're going to hear a lot of volatility, and you might even see a strike or two.
Thank you very much. Okay, we do have some questions from the floor, if you wouldn't mind taking them. One delegate, I have practiced my dental profession honestly and to the highest ethical standards. From the start of my career, I became a slave to my paycheck, the insurance companies and brokers, financial advisors, leasing companies, etc. As a South African, I'm having to pay twice for me and for my family to stay alive. Through all levels of taxation, including rates and levies, I pay for national security, national education, security, SAPS policing, etc., 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 educating my children, ADT, medical aids. The present system has failed me. I looked for gaps in the system to survive. What advice do I give to my children not to get caught up in a lifetime of perpetual stress and hopeless financial subjugation?
Wow, that is quite rough. Yeah, listen, I think it's probably the case for many South Africans, and the reality for many South Africans, and for many South Africans, probably even worse because they don't even have a paycheck. And so, yes, I absolutely get what you're saying. What advice do I have for you? What advice can you give your children? I think it's education, education, education. I also think very importantly that people need to be flexible. They need to accept the reality of lifelong learning. Unfortunately, we're in an incredibly competitive race globally, and it just means that there's no way around it. We have to keep learning, we have to keep upskilling, we have to keep doing that part. I also believe that the advice you can give your children is to make sure that they are very tech savvy, and that a lot of the future and a lot of future business will occur on those sorts of platforms. And then finally, to save and to start early, to save and invest and to start early. That I think is what I would recommend.
Thank you, Nikki. Okay, our next question is, Matimba spoke about qualitative easing a few months ago. I think he meant quantitative easing. In any case, many countries, including the US and UK, are involved in printing and distributing the helicopter money which has propped up the economies. Do you think this would be a solution to our fiscal nightmare in South Africa? Our coffers were dry even before COVID hit us. If the US and the UK can do it, why can't we in South Africa do the same? The fiscal deficit is many times more than ours in SA. If there's more money available, the civil servants can at least be given the increases they are demanding. Without the public servants, this country will collapse. We cannot throw them under the bus. Do you agree with Matimba?
No, I don't actually agree with him at all. And I do not agree. I mean, we all see the value of civil servants, but I think that they certainly haven't been done in, you know. I just look at the average increases in Nedbank over the last couple of years, and I assure you the civil servants have been better off than many people in the private sector. So that's the first point to bear in mind. I absolutely do not agree with him. Now, listen, I'm more than willing to come and do a presentation about quantitative easing and its consequences to you in the future if you want to, or maybe Nedbank can arrange it and people can come in. It is actually quite a complicated thing to explain, and certainly in a short little neat wrapped up answer. The key difference here comes down to, very simply, at the end of the day, we're probably going to have to print money if we cannot fund the budget deficit anyway. Indirectly, we're going to have to print money. But what you must understand, and why we are not a United States, we are not a UK. Yes, their debt burden is a lot higher, but their economies are far bigger. They grow a lot faster. Their interest rates are a lot lower. And more importantly, investors are willing to hold their debt. Now, that is the key thing you've got to bear in mind. And in South Africa's case, investors do not trust us. Investors are not willing to hold our debt. So we can go print that money. All that's going to happen is we're going to have hyperinflation, because we are very similar to Venezuela. So the key thing is, yes, you might say it's incredibly unfair. The United States debt is way bigger than ours. It's almost 90% of their GDP. Why can they do it? because investors trust the US Federal Reserve. They do not trust us. That's the big difference it comes down to. All right. So no, I don't agree with him. And if we went down that road, we will know what true suffering is.
Nikki, sorry, could you just change your view and take the presentation off?
Yes, I can do that. What I just unshare, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Is it gone now?
No, it isn't.
Oopsie. Okay. It doesn't give me the option to stop sharing. Oh, there it is. Stop sharing. Okay, I've done it.
That's it. Right. Okay. Political analyst Matimba Khosa said in a webinar earlier this year that the government is nurturing a wholly consumption economy by an overpaid and bloated civil service and the growing of a non-visible consumer-orientated black middle class. There's otherwise no real growth in the economy with an unemployment rate of 32.5%. 1 in 2 graduates are unable to get a job. A production-orientated economy like in other countries is not a priority for the government. Mbeki thinks we are on a quick slide to a massive fiscal cliff. Many private sector economists have pointed out that the civil service is bloated, overpaid, and non-productive. The public sector does not directly contribute to the productive economy. Do you also share that sentiment?
Listen, I think they're highly inefficient. I mean, the evidence of that is everywhere, absolutely everywhere. We don't just have to go to the worst examples, which are your Escoms and your Transnets and your SABCs and your SAAs. You just have to go to your local municipality to get evidence of that. So we see the decay in our roads and our infrastructure. So yes, they are inefficient. Are they too large for the size of the economy? In other words, bloated? Yes, absolutely. They are too large for the size of the economy. We have one of the biggest civil service, and we have one of the narrowest tax bases in the world. So yes, it has to be trimmed. It has to be brought in line with the size of the economy.
Thank you. Right, then. Will South Africa become beholden to the IMF, the European Central Bank, the World Bank, and China, like many countries in South America and Africa, because of national debt owing to them? Will our national budgets eventually be decided in Brussels or Beijing because of our monetary debt to them? Of every 4 rand in the fiscus, 1 rand goes to debt repayment. Will they force austerity measures on us and in the process take over our pension funds because of the escalating national debt, like the European Central Bank and IMF did in Greece?
Yeah, okay, so let's put Greece's debt burden in perspective. Greece firstly lied about their finances, so that's never a good idea. And then secondly, their debt burden hit 187% of GDP, so we're not quite there yet. We took IMF emergency funding, which in fact comes with absolutely no conditionality. All right, so zero conditionality. So will we be forced to implement austerity measures? No. If we take more funding from the IMF, which we could qualify for, and we go through the official IMF funding route, will conditionality be placed on us? Yes, it will. But if you want that money, then you have to accept that reality. Will it be necessary for government under the current circumstances to take on more IMF funding? No, it won't. They can probably fund it out of the domestic market. In fact, that's what they did last year. Remember, bond issuance last year increased 4-fold, right? Foreigners actually bought less South African debt. So almost all of that debt was taken up by South African and domestic investors. So this is a fairly grim picture painted here, but we are not there. We are not there. Our foreign debt is minuscule compared to our domestic debt.
Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, economists like epidemiologists are soothsayers. Is there still an inkling of hope and optimism for one to still stay on in South Africa? Do you think the government will take control of our pension funds to service the debt burden? I cannot imagine where else they will get the money with the economy, both locally and internationally, looking bleak.
Okay, so listen, the choice to immigrate, the choice to stay or the choice to go is a personal one. There are many reasons why people make these decisions. South Africa has been through an unbelievably difficult 10 years. There's no denying that. And in that period, we have really seen conditions deteriorate. So, I mean, there's no denying that. Is there any reason to say that's a personal choice you have to make? The one thing I can tell you is that the world is starting to look a little bit better. I can certainly see that everybody on this line are very discouraged. They are very depressed. But the world economy is starting to pick up. The vaccination process in the US is gathering pace. The UK is doing excellently. The Eurozone, where they've been quite slow, they're also gaining pace. Markets are starting to see the end of this COVID-19. We now have a reasonable person in charge of the United States. And they want to start infrastructure spending. And unlike us, they have the ability to do that. If they do that, they're going to need commodities. And we are producers and exporters of commodities. So there's going to be a little bit of a silver lining as far as that's concerned. So, you know, in all honesty, I know it is a very difficult time we've been in through. It's depressing for all of us. But I can't tell you, I can't tell you to stay or to go. That is a personal decision. But I think that it isn't all doom and gloom. There is still opportunity for growth. But yes, there's no denying it will take a big effort from government side, specifically from government side, to restore the trust and certainly to put South Africa back on a sustainable path.
Right. The state of the SA economy is worse now than a year ago, yet the year-to-date performance of the stock market does not reflect this. It has performed better than expected. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, no, the stock market really is driven to a large extent by what happens globally. So it's almost completely divorced from the reality on the ground. So the reality on the ground has been very, very grim. But what we saw globally is, remember, equity markets look forward. And what we saw is an enormous correction in equity markets. And then investors, with all of that money printing and sloshing around the system, liquidity looking for a home, investors went, well, what's a good place to invest? So tech was an obvious good place to invest in. All digital platforms were a good place to invest in. Gold was a good place to invest in, maybe just in case all of this money printing results in inflation. So the bottom line is, the markets just started running. And then came the vaccine, and they started pricing in the possibility of an end to this crisis and some return or to some semblance of normality and stronger economic growth. And at the end of the day, what that boils down to, and of course what that means, is that we saw this strong rally. And the JSE just got lifted in the process. And one of the biggest areas that we saw run very hard and very strong has been resources. And that's this whole Joe Biden fixed investment in your rich countries, need for commodities, strong China, need for commodities. And so our resources sector and resource share prices have increased very strongly. But listen, to be honest with you, I think it is overdone. I think the markets are starting to look quite fragile. I think there's a very strong possibility that we will have corrections going forward.
Right. Will the fact that the market responded positively to Tito's budget be something that the rating agencies look toward and give a thumbs up? One thing that may favorably assist the budgetary implementation and ultimately SA economy?
Yeah, it's good news. It's good news that the markets responded. No one expected that they were going to try and reduce the deficit a little bit faster. No one anticipated that. Everybody expected taxes would go up. Taxes did not go up, and everybody thought they'd sort of step back on this whole thing of public sector wage bill restraint, and they didn't. So the fact that they stuck to their guns, I think that was read in a positive light in the market, and we saw that reflected. Listen, the rating agencies, we are sub-investment grade. I don't think they're going to take any action this year. What they are going to be waiting to see is that government actually implement the structural reforms they've promised, particularly the deregulation of the energy sector.
Okay, then what will it take for investors to trust South Africa?
Well, implementing things. So if you say you're going to do something, then do it. Like one of the things we've heard repeatedly is we're going to change the immigration bill so more skilled people can come to South Africa. We've been saying this for 10 years. We haven't done it yet. If you say you're going to auction new spectrum, then do it. Again, we said that 2 years ago. We're still in the process of auctioning spectrum, and it's more recently, it's again been postponed. We said we're going to buy additional energy from companies from embedded generation, so companies that produce a lot of energy as a result of their production process could sell energy to the grid. They still haven't changed the laws to make that possible. We're going on 2 years now from the point where we said that. I think that's what it takes to trust us again. If we say we're going to do something, do it. Don't let it become this never ending, we will, but we never actually do it. That's what it takes to get trust.
All right. And now a final question from one of our older members. What is your advice for us little guys to preserve our savings?
Okay, so I'm not an investment analyst, so and I'm certainly also not what do you call it? A private wealth advisor, and I would really recommend that you certainly speak to them. But to preserve your savings, I think in this environment it is very tricky because what you're seeing globally is that equity prices have run very, very strongly. They are starting to look toppish. They are starting to look quite pricey. But for me, a big portion of this would be obviously holding hard currency. And it's almost like a hedge against uncertainty. Your returns on it are not spectacular, but it does hold value. So I would certainly be looking at, diversifying my savings out of South Africa to some extent, have some of it in dollars, some of it in euros, and maybe even in Swiss franc, so that you have a bit of a hedge against that uncertainty. And then the other thing that I would definitely also consider is to look at the gilts market. We do pay good yields, and in other words, you will beat inflation if you put your money in the bond market. And if you look at some kind of gilts fund, it will depend on you which one you prefer. There are many out there, and maybe speak to your financial advisor as far as that's concerned. And then the final thing that I would recommend is that if you're going to go for equities, it's very important that you focus on those companies that tend to pay dividends, that are large defensive stocks, and that you accept that you keep them for the long term. All right. In other words, you ride out the cycle. So that would be my advice.
Thank you very much, Nikki, and thank you for stepping in at the last minute. And
no, we are so sorry. We don't know what went wrong there and why it didn't want to work. But after all the fiddling with the IT people, we just realized we're wasting your time. I have it on the system. We'll just jump in and do it. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll certainly take you up on that offer of a discussion on quantitative easing.
Yes, I think it's quite important. People don't understand the dangers, but I'm more than willing to talk you through it slowly and systematically, that you can see the links and why different rules apply to different countries.
Thank you, and thanks to Nedbank for sponsoring this evening. Thanks everyone for bearing with us, and we wish you all a good evening. Good night.